The word spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire on a dry Texas plain, and by the time Susan Morgan walked into the town's single courthouse with her head held high and her hands trembling at her sides, every soul within 20 miles already knew what she was about to do. She was going to marry a stranger, not just any stranger. She was going to stand before Judge Elias Combs and speak vows to a man she had met exactly 4 days ago. A man who smelled of trail dust and gunpowder, and something darker underneath. A man whose name alone made saloon keepers wipe down their bars a little faster and cattle ranchers lock their daughters inside. She was going to marry Henry Garrison, the most feared gunslinger in the whole of the New Mexico territory, and she was going to do it because if she did not, she would lose everything her father had bled to build. Henry stood at the front of that low-ceilinged room with his back straight and his jaw set like iron, and he did not look at Susan when she walked in. He stared at the wall above the judge's head, and his expression carried no warmth, no invitation, and no visible trace of the secret that sat between them like a lit stick of dynamite. They were strangers performing a transaction, and every person crowded into the doorway and pressed against the single grimy window knew it. Except something had happened the night before that none of them knew about. Something that had cracked the armor around Henry Garrison's chest in a place he had not let anything touch in 9 years. Susan reached the front of the room and finally looked at him, and the terror in her dark eyes was not the terror of a woman who feared a violent man. It was the terror of a woman who was dangerously close to trusting one, and that, she understood with a clarity that cut straight to the bone, was far more dangerous than anything his reputation promised. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly, low enough that only he could hear. Henry Garrison turned his head and looked at her for the first time that morning, and something moved behind his pale gray eyes that he immediately locked down and buried. "I gave you my word," he said. That was all. 3 words. And somehow those 3 words told her more about the hidden depths of this man than anything she had learned in all the days of frantic, desperate searching that had brought her to this impossible moment. To understand how Susan Morgan ended up standing in a courthouse in Dusty Creek, New Mexico, in the spring of 1883, preparing to marry a legend and a ghost, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to the morning she found her father's letter, and to the afternoon she discovered that everything she believed about her life was built on a lie someone else had been telling for years. Thomas Morgan had been a good man in most of the ways that counted. He had come west from Tennessee in 1861, not to fight in the war that tore the country apart behind him, but to chase a dream of land and cattle and a life built by honest labor. He had claimed a parcel of high desert grassland outside the town of Dusty Creek, and he had worked that land with his wife Eleanor for 18 years before Eleanor died of fever in 1879, leaving Thomas alone with their daughter Susan, and a cattle operation that was just beginning to show real promise. Susan had been 22 years old when her mother died. By 1883, she was 26, and she had taken over half the work of the ranch without being asked, because it needed doing and she was capable of doing it. She could ride, she could manage accounts, she could negotiate with buyers at the stock market in Santa Fe, and she could read a contract well enough to know when someone was trying to trick her. She was not a delicate woman. She was a Western woman, shaped by hard seasons and honest work, and she had a kind of quiet strength that people respected even when they could not quite explain why. Her father had been declining for 2 years. His heart, the doctor said. Thomas Morgan spent more time in the house and less time in the saddle, and Susan had taken on more and more and more without complaint. She loved her father. She loved the land. She intended to hold both of them together for as long as she could. She had not known about the debt. She found the letter on a Tuesday morning in early April, tucked inside the tin box her father kept under his bed, which she opened only because Thomas had asked her to retrieve a bill of sale he needed to sign. The letter from the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company of Denver was dated 18 months earlier, and it outlined in cold legal language the terms of a loan Thomas Morgan had taken out against the deed to the Morgan Ranch. $12,000, borrowed to cover losses from a catastrophic cattle die-off the previous winter, losses that Thomas had hidden from Susan entirely because he could not bear to admit to his daughter how badly things had gone. The loan was due to be repaid in full by May the 15th. That was 6 weeks away. The letter also contained a clause that Susan read 3 times before she fully understood it. The Consolidated Land and Cattle Company would not transfer the deed of the Morgan Ranch to a single woman. If Thomas Morgan died before the debt was repaid, which the company clearly anticipated, the property would pass to his male heir. If no male heir existed, the company had the right to foreclose immediately and take possession. Susan sat on the edge of her father's bed and held that letter for a long time. Thomas died 4 days later. He went quietly in his sleep, which was a mercy, and Susan sat beside him and held his hand and told him she was not angry, even though she was furious and heartbroken and terrified all at once. She told him she loved him and she would take care of everything, because that was what she had always done. She buried him on the hill behind the house, next to her mother, on a clear cold morning with the desert mountains turning pink in the early light, and she let herself cry exactly once, standing alone at the graveside after the few neighbors who had come to pay respects had gone home. One good cry, long and hard and private, and then she wiped her face and walked back down to the ranch house and started making plans. The plans were not simple. She had 6 weeks, essentially no liquid money, a cattle operation that was viable but not immediately profitable, and a legal system that treated her ownership of her own family's land as conditional on her marital status. She had spoken to the one attorney in Dusty Creek, a soft-bellied man named Aldrich Fletcher who smelled of pomade and bourbon, and Fletcher had confirmed what she already knew. The clause was legal and enforceable. The Consolidated Land and Cattle Company was entirely within its rights, and the company's local representative, a man named Virgil Crane, had already been making inquiries around town about the property. Virgil Crane was the piece of this that frightened Susan most. She had met Crane twice. He was a slender, precise man in his early 40s, with a northeastern accent and small, careful eyes that moved over everything as if calculating its worth. He worked for the company, but he also had a personal interest in the Morgan land that went beyond business. He had been trying to purchase the adjacent property from its current owner, old Pete Harlow, for 3 years, and Pete Harlow kept refusing because Harlow and Thomas Morgan had always been friendly, and Harlow did not want to see his neighbor's land absorbed by some Denver company. If Crane got the Morgan Ranch through foreclosure, it would put enough pressure on Harlow that the old man might finally fold. Crane stood to make a great deal of money from this situation if things went the way he intended them to go. He was not going to make it easy for Susan to find a solution. The solution, as the attorney Fletcher had reluctantly outlined it, was marriage. If Susan married a man before May the 15th, the deed would transfer to her husband and the foreclosure clause would be satisfied. The debt would still need to be paid, but at least she would not lose the land through a legal technicality. And if she could keep the land, she had a plan for the debt. She had spoken to a cattle buyer in Santa Fe who was willing to advance against the spring herd, and if she could negotiate a fair price, she could cover most of the $12,000 over the next year. The problem was finding a husband in 6 weeks in a town of 400 people who largely knew her business by the 3rd day after her father's funeral. There were men in Dusty Creek who would have married Susan Morgan under other circumstances. She was a good-looking woman, dark-haired and straight-backed, with an honest face and a reputation for hard work and good sense. Under ordinary circumstances, she might have had options. But under these circumstances, every eligible man in town knew she came attached to a $12,000 debt, a contested property, and a powerful company that wanted her land. The few men who expressed initial interest withdrew it quickly once the full picture became clear. She could not blame them. She would have made the same calculation herself. She was running out of time and running out of options when she heard about Henry Garrison. She heard about him the way everyone heard about him, in pieces and rumors that accumulated into something that felt more like legend than biography. He had come to the territory from somewhere east. Nobody agreed on exactly where. He had a reputation with a gun that was either exaggerated or understated, depending on who was telling the story. He had ridden for cattle outfits, for private security companies, once briefly for the law before some disagreement that nobody would explain clearly. He was 31 years old and unmarried, and he was currently staying at the Dusty Creek Hotel, which was the only place in town that rented rooms by the week. She heard one other thing about Henry Garrison that made her sit very still when the woman at the dry goods store mentioned it in a carefully low voice, as if saying it too loudly might summon consequences. He had turned down money from Virgil Crane. Crane had approached Garrison 3 weeks ago, apparently intending to hire him for something, and Garrison had turned him down flat. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what Crane had asked. But the fact of the refusal had gotten around, and it meant something, though Susan was not yet sure what. She went to the hotel on a Wednesday afternoon, 12 days after her father's funeral, with her hair neat and her best day dress on, and her heart beating faster than she would ever admit to anyone. She asked the man at the desk for Henry Garrison's room number, and the man looked at her with an expression of pure bewilderment that she ignored entirely. She knocked on the door of room 6. There was a long silence. Then a voice, low and careful and entirely without warmth, said, "What do you want?" "My name is Susan Morgan," she said to the door. "I own the Morgan Cattle Ranch south of town. I have a business proposition that I think would benefit both of us, and I would be grateful for 5 minutes of your time." Another silence. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. Henry Garrison opened the door and looked at her, and Susan's first impression was of a man who was intensely, almost exhaustingly watchful. He was taller than she had expected, lean in the way of men who moved a great deal and ate when they could, with sun-darkened skin and pale gray eyes that assessed her with a speed and thoroughness that she found slightly unnerving. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, and there was a scar along his jaw that she deliberately did not look at. He was dressed plainly, in good quality trail clothes that had been carefully maintained, and there was nothing about him that performed danger the way she had expected. He looked controlled, and that, she thought, was actually more unsettling. 5 minutes, he said. She said what she had come to say. She told him about the loan, and the clause in Virgil Crane, and the timeline, and the cattle buyer in Santa Fe. She told him the truth because she had decided, lying awake at 4 in the morning 3 nights before, that manipulation was a strategy she could not afford and would not use. She told him exactly what she needed, what she could offer in return, and why she had come to him specifically. She told him about his refusal of Crane. "That tells me you either have principles or a personal conflict with him," she said. "Either way, you are not working for the side that wants to take my family's land. That makes you the only man in this town whose motivations I can reasonably trust." Henry Garrison stood in his hotel doorway and listened to all of this without moving or changing expression. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment in which she could read absolutely nothing from his face. "What are the terms?" he said. She told him. She would deed him a 20% stake in the Morgan Ranch, which would make the marriage financially real and not merely legal theater. He would help with the ranch operations, at least nominally, until the debt was satisfied. After that, if he chose to leave, they could make whatever legal arrangements were necessary. She was not asking for a permanent arrangement, she said, though the word arrangement came out sounding smaller and sadder than she had intended. He studied her for another long moment. "I need to think about it," he said. "Come back tomorrow." She went back the next morning and he said yes. That should have been straightforward. It was not straightforward, because that same afternoon, while Susan was in Fletcher's office going over the paperwork that would need to be filed before the wedding, Virgil Crane walked in. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like a man who had expected this development and had already prepared for it. He sat down across the desk from her without being invited, set his hat on his knee, and looked at her with those small, calculating eyes. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I understand you're in a difficult situation. I want you to know that the company is not unsympathetic. I have an attorney present," she said, meaning Fletcher, who was currently looking at the floor. "Please direct any communication through him." "Of course," Crane said pleasantly. "But I think you might want to hear this directly. The company would be willing to extend the repayment deadline by 60 days if you would agree to sell the eastern quarter of your grazing land at current market value. It's a fair offer. It would give you time to arrange your finances without having to make any hasty decisions." Susan looked at him. The eastern quarter was the parcel that bordered Pete Harlow's land. If she sold it, Crane would have his corridor, and the pressure on Harlow would begin. "No," she said. Crane's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes that made the air in the room feel slightly colder. "I would encourage you to consider it carefully," he said. "A hasty marriage to someone like Henry Garrison carries its own kind of risk, as I'm sure you understand." The threat in that sentence was dressed up so neatly in concern that Fletcher probably missed it entirely. Susan did not miss it. "Good day, Mr. Crane," she said. He put his hat on and left, and Susan sat very still for 30 seconds before she allowed herself to exhale. That evening she went back to the hotel to tell Henry what had happened, because she had decided that honesty was her only strategy, and that meant honesty about everything, including threats she was not sure she fully understood yet. She knocked on the door of room 6 again, and he answered faster this time, as if he had been expecting her. She told him about Crane's visit. Henry listened without sitting down. He moved to the window and looked out at the dusty street below while she talked, and she watched the set of his shoulders and tried to read what she could not see in his face. When she finished, he said, "Crane knows who I am." "I assumed he did," she said. "Is that a problem?" Henry turned from the window and looked at her, and for the first time something came through the careful blankness of his expression that she could not immediately name. It was not fear. It was something older than fear, something that had been living inside him so long it had become structural. "It could be," he said. "There's history there between me and Crane." She waited. He took a breath. 3 years ago, in a town called Callaway in southern Colorado, Crane hired a man to do a job. The man did the job, and what he did destroyed a family and cost 2 innocent people everything they had. I was working security for a mining company at the time, and I found out what had happened after the fact. I looked into it. What I found was enough to make Crane's employers in Denver very uncomfortable if it ever came to light. "So Crane has reason to want you gone," Susan said. "He has reason to want me quiet," Henry said. "Gone, quiet, or dead. Any of those would suit him." The word dead hung in the air between them for a moment. "That's the real reason he approached you," Susan said. "Not to hire you, to find out if you were going to be a problem. And when I turned him down, he found out," Henry said. "Yes," Susan processed this. The web of it was more complicated and more dangerous than she had understood 2 hours ago, and the part of her that had been carefully rational and strategic since her father's death wanted to recount the risks. But there was another part of her, a part she was only just beginning to acknowledge, that felt something entirely different standing in this spare hotel room with this watchful, guarded man who had just told her something true about himself when he could easily have said nothing. "Does this change your answer?" she said. Henry Garrison looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she got the sense of someone standing at a crossroads they had been approaching for a very long time. "No," he said. "Why not?" He almost smiled. It was barely there, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully formed. "Because you need a husband," he said, "and I gave you my word." She slept badly that night. not from fear but from a strange, restless awareness that something was happening inside her that she had not budgeted for. She was supposed to be making a practical arrangement with a practical man. She was not supposed to be lying in the dark thinking about the way his voice sounded when he said things he meant. The wedding was arranged for the following morning, but the evening before changed everything in ways that neither of them had planned for. Susan had gone to check on the ranch, which was being watched by her two hired hands, brothers named Cal and Danny Rays, who had worked for her father for 5 years and who she trusted. She had matters to attend to and paperwork to organize, and she did not get back to town until it was nearly dark. She was coming along the main street on her horse when she saw a lamp burning in the hotel window, and more importantly, saw Virgil Crane's carriage parked outside the building that served as Dusty Creek's combination jail and marshal's office. She stopped and looked at that carriage for a long moment. Something cold and certain moved through her chest. She tied her horse, went up to the hotel, and knocked on Henry's door with a little more force than she intended. He opened it immediately, and she saw from his expression that he had already heard whatever it was she was about to tell him. "Crane filed a complaint with the marshal," he said, before she could speak. "What kind of complaint?" "Warrant out of Colorado. Old accusation, one that was thrown out years ago but never properly expunged. Assault and destruction of property." His voice was level, but she could hear the edge beneath it, the controlled anger of a man who had spent years watching his past be weaponized against him. "It's a false charge. Was false then, is false now. But if the marshal picks me up tonight, I'm in a cell until someone can sort out the paperwork, and that will take longer than 6 weeks. Susan's breath caught. Crane's move was elegant and brutal. He had not threatened, had not confronted. He had simply used the machinery of the law to remove the obstacle before the wedding could happen. "How long do we have?" she said. "Marshal Hicks drinks at the saloon until 9, Henry said. After that he makes his rounds. If the complaint was filed before 6, he's required to act on it tonight." She looked at him. He looked at her. The calculation was instant and mutual. "Judge Combs," she said. "He lives on Pine Street. I know him. My father knew him. Can we get him to perform the ceremony tonight?" "I do not know," she said honestly, "but I am going to find out." They went together, Susan and Henry Garrison, through the back alleys of Dusty Creek in the blue Texas dusk, and she felt the surreality of it as something almost physical, the absurdity and the urgency and the knowledge that nothing about this resembled the life she had imagined. She had imagined marrying someone she loved. She had imagined a Sunday in a proper church with flowers, and the people who mattered to her sitting in the pews, and her father alive to walk her down the aisle. She pushed those thoughts aside with the same practiced efficiency. She had been pushing difficult thoughts aside for weeks. Judge Elias Combs was 64 years old, a widower and a man who had known Thomas Morgan for 20 years. He opened his front door in his shirt sleeves, took one look at Susan and the man standing behind her and said, "I heard rumors today that I hoped were not true." "They are true," Susan said, "and there is a circumstance I need to explain to you." She explained it, all of it. The loan, the clause, Crane's complaint to the marshal, the timeline that had just been compressed from morning to hours. Judge Combs listened with his arms crossed and his expression growing progressively more disgusted, and she could not tell who the disgust was directed at until he said, flatly, "Virgil Crane is a snake in fine clothes, and this warrant business is exactly the kind of thing he would do." He looked at Henry with the directness of a man who had long ago decided that life was too short for social performance. "You Henry Garrison?" "Yes, sir," Henry said. "You treating this woman right?" A pause. Then quietly, "I'm going to try." Something in that answer seemed to satisfy the judge in a way that a more polished response might not have. Combs looked at Susan. "You understand what you're doing?" "I understand what I need," she said. "Whether I understand all of what I'm doing is a question I'm going to have to answer over time." Combs almost smiled. He put on his coat and got his Bible and called his housekeeper as a witness, and he married Susan Morgan and Henry Garrison in his front parlor by lamplight, with the sound of the street outside and the smell of old books and pipe tobacco filling the small room. The ceremony was brief. The judge read the necessary words, and they repeated the necessary promises. And when Combs told Henry he could kiss his bride, there was a moment of absolute stillness between them that stretched and might have been unbearable, except that Henry leaned forward very carefully and pressed his lips to Susan's cheek, just beside the corner of her mouth. And the warmth of that small, restrained gesture went through her like something she had not known she was waiting for. They walked back to the hotel as man and wife. They walked side by side without touching, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was too much to say and no established language yet for any of it. "I'll sleep in the chair," Henry said when they reached his room. "That is not necessary," she said. "It is a large enough bed and we are both adults." She paused. "But thank you for the offer." He nodded once. They arranged themselves in the practical way of two people managing an impossible situation. And Susan lay in the dark, listening to him breathe from across the room, and thought about the way he had said, "I'm going to try," and tried to understand why those 3 words had affected her the way they had. She thought it was because she recognized something in them. The honesty of a person who could not make promises they were not sure they could keep, but who intended to keep them anyway. She was asleep within the hour, which surprised her. In the morning they went to the courthouse, and she walked in to find what felt like half of Dusty Creek there to witness the formality of the legal registration, and she held herself very straight and did not look at anyone except the judge and the man standing beside her. And when Henry said to her, low enough that only she could hear, "You do not have to do this," she heard in it the same thing she had heard the night before in his front parlor. The unwillingness to take anything from her that she had not freely chosen. She said, "I gave you my word too." And the registration was completed and they were, fully and legally, husband and wife. They moved out to the Morgan Ranch that afternoon. Susan had the larger bedroom that had been her parents', and Henry took the second room that had been Susan's growing up, and she showed him the operation with the directness and practicality she brought to everything, pointing out the herd, the grazing rotations, the water situation, the fencing that needed repair. Henry listened and looked and asked practical questions, and she realized she had not expected him to take the ranch seriously, and was surprised that he did. Cal and Danny Reyes sized him up with the wary honesty of men who had no patience for pretense, and by the end of the first day, Cal had apparently decided Henry was acceptable, based on the fact that Henry had spent 3 hours fixing a section of fence that had been waiting for attention for 2 months without being asked or directed. Danny took a little longer. Danny was 24 and protective of Susan in the way of someone who had watched her carry too much alone for too long, and he spent the first several days watching Henry with narrow eyes. But Henry seemed to understand what the scrutiny meant and did not bristle at it, which itself told Danny something. The days fell into a rhythm. They worked. They ate together in the evenings. They talked about the ranch and the debt, and the progress of the negotiations with the Santa Fe buyer, a man named Horatio Wells, who was coming to inspect the herd in 2 weeks. In those early evenings over simple suppers, Susan learned things about Henry Garrison that did not match what the rumors had constructed. He was thoughtful in a way that surprised her. He read, when he had time, not the dime novels that made men like him into cartoons but history and natural science, and he had opinions about things that had nothing to do with guns or territory or reputation. He was good with the horses, not just competent but genuinely skilled, with a patient quality around animals that she found unexpectedly moving. He cooked breakfast without complaint, and he cleaned up after himself, and he never once made her feel that she owed him more than she had already offered. She began to be afraid that she was falling in love with him. It was not a comfortable fear. She had built her entire life since her mother's death around practical competence, around managing the next problem, around being the person who held things together. Love, in this context, felt like a vulnerability she could not afford. And it was complicated by the fact that she had no idea what Henry felt, because Henry Garrison's interior life was defended like a well-supplied fort, and she could read him better now than she had in that hotel room, but she still could not read him well enough to know if what she thought she saw in his eyes sometimes was real or a projection of her own wishful thinking. The situation with Virgil Crane did not go away. The warrant business had died when Marshal Hicks looked at the Colorado paperwork more carefully and found it was, as Henry had said, an old dismissed charge that Crane had reactivated through a contact in Denver. Hicks was a slow-moving man but an honest one, and he was annoyed at having been used, and he told Crane so in terms that apparently left Crane temporarily without obvious options. But Crane was not done. 3 weeks after the wedding, Susan rode out to check the eastern boundary fence and found it cut. Not broken, not damaged by weather or animals. Cut cleanly in 3 places, and 2 of her cattle had wandered onto Harlow's land. It was not a major incident, but it was a deliberate one, and the message was legible. Crane had people watching, and he was willing to cause small problems that added up. Henry went out to look at the cut fence without being asked, and when he came back his expression was neutral but his eyes were cold. "He's testing," Henry said. "I know," Susan said. "He wants to know how we respond, whether we respond." He looked at her. "We need to talk about the Colorado evidence." She looked back at him. This was the thing she had known was coming since the night he told her about it. The conversation she had been waiting for because it felt like the real center of what was happening between them, not just legally but in every other way that mattered. "Tell me," she said. He did. He told her all of it, sitting at the kitchen table in the late evening with the lamp between them and the desert night pressing quiet against the windows. He told her about Callaway, Colorado, in 1880, about the family whose homestead had been flooded deliberately when a dam on company land was broken open, about the evidence he had found that tied the order for that action directly to Virgil Crane, about the 2 people who had lost their home and their livelihood, about the documents he had kept, copies made before he was run out of the territory by a set of circumstances that were clearly engineered, about the dark past he carried, which was not the violent past that his reputation implied but something subtler and more corrosive, the past of a man who had known something and done nothing fast enough and who had been paying for that failure in the currency of restlessness and isolation ever since. Susan listened to all of it and did not look away from him. "Where are the documents now?" she said. "Santa Fe," he said, "with a man I trust. Can you get them?" "Yes." "Then we get them," she said. "We get them, and we put them somewhere that Crane cannot reach, and we find out if there is an attorney in Denver who is not in the company's pocket. Because this is not just about my land anymore, is it? This is about what he did in Colorado and what he is planning to do here and everywhere else he goes." Henry was very still for a moment. Then he said, "You would do that." "It is the right thing to do," she said simply. "You have been carrying this alone for 3 years. You should not have to carry it alone anymore." Something shifted in Henry Garrison's face in that moment. The fort that he had built and maintained and defended for years developed a crack so slight that anyone else might have missed it entirely. But Susan was watching very carefully, and she did not miss it. "Susan," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every time before. It was not careful or neutral or controlled. It was raw in a way that made her breath catch. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did not expect you," he said. It was not an explanation or a declaration. It was just the truth, and it hung between them in the lamplight like something that needed answering. "I did not expect you either," she said. He reached across the table very slowly, as if giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and calloused and careful, and she turned hers over and held it, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a long time without saying anything else, because there was nothing more that needed saying just then. The arrangement between them changed after that. Not dramatically, not with declarations or grand gestures, but in the quiet way that real things change, gradually and then all at once. They started sitting closer together in the evenings. He started coming to find her when something needed discussing, instead of waiting to be sought out. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, small things and large ones, memories of her mother and her private fears about the debt, and a story about a horse she had loved as a child that had been sold when money was tight, the loss of which she had mourned in secret for years. He listened to everything with a quality of attention that she had never experienced before, not passive or polite but genuinely present, as if what she said mattered to him in a personal way, as if learning her was something he was investing in. He told her things too, slowly, in pieces. About growing up in Missouri with a father who was largely absent and a mother who was fiercely capable, which explained certain things about his ability to respect a competent woman without feeling threatened by it. About the years of drifting and the jobs he had taken, and the things he had seen, and the accumulated weight of a life that had been full of motion and empty of belonging. "I never stayed anywhere long enough for it to become home," he said one evening. They were on the porch watching the sun go down behind the red desert mountains, and the light was the color of copper, and the air smelled of warm dust and the faint green of the desert after an afternoon rain. "I used to think that was because I liked to move. I think now it was because I did not believe I had any right to stay." Susan looked at him. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man with my reputation is not supposed to want a house and a porch and a view of the mountains," he said. "Not supposed to want quiet. I spent a long time being what other people needed me to be, and not thinking about what I wanted, because wanting things seemed like a luxury I had not earned." She thought about that. Then she said, "You can stay here. I mean that as more than a legal fact." He looked at her. The pale gray eyes were unguarded in a way she was only beginning to recognize as his version of complete openness. "I know you mean it," he said. "That's the part that I am still getting used to." Horatio Wells came from Santa Fe on a Thursday, 3.5 weeks after the wedding. He was a businesslike man in his 50s with a good eye for cattle and a reputation for fair dealing, and he spent half a day going over the herd with the thoroughness of someone who made expensive decisions for a living. Henry was there for all of it, quiet and observant, and when Wells began his negotiation, Henry sat beside Susan and let her lead it without interference, except for one moment when Wells made an offer that was below reasonable and Henry said, very calmly, "That is not the number we discussed in our correspondence, Mr. Wells," which caused Wells to look at him with a slight recalibration and come up by $800. Susan gave Henry a sidelong look when Wells had gone to inspect the water situation with Cal, and Henry met her eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile that she was coming to treasure because it was so rare and therefore so genuine. "You let me lead," she said. "It was your negotiation," he said. "Most men would not have done that." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not most men," he said, and it was not arrogance. It was something simpler and truer. It was a man telling a woman exactly who he was. The deal with Wells was struck at a figure that, combined with what they already had and the remaining cattle sales through the summer, would cover the debt by winter. It was tight, but it was possible, and Susan felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched for 2 months. The land was safe. Her parents' work was safe. She found a moment of privacy that afternoon and stood by the fence at the edge of the near pasture, and allowed herself to feel the relief fully, and the grief underneath it, and the strange, improbable gratitude for the series of events that had brought a stranger to her door and placed him, somehow, at the center of her life. She had not solved all of it yet. Crane was still a problem. Crane became a more visible problem the week after Wells's visit, when he filed an injunction through the territorial court, attempting to challenge the legality of the marriage on the grounds that it had been performed under duress. It was a thin argument, as Fletcher told her with something approaching actual backbone for once, but it was enough to create uncertainty while the territorial court considered it, and Crane knew that uncertainty was its own kind of weapon. Henry sent a letter to Santa Fe the day the injunction was filed. The letter was to the man who was holding the Colorado documents. It said, "It is time." Susan wrote to a Denver attorney named James Whitfield, whose name she had obtained through 3 careful inquiries at territorial level. Whitfield was known for taking cases against large corporate interests, which was not common in 1883 and made him unpopular in certain circles and indispensable in others. She wrote him a detailed letter explaining the situation in Callaway and the current situation in Dusty Creek, and enclosed 2 letters of reference, one from Judge Combs and one from Marshall Hicks, who had by this point developed a significant personal dislike of Virgil Crane. Then they waited, and while they waited, they worked and they talked and they ate together every evening, and something that had begun as an arrangement was becoming unmistakably and irreversibly something else. It was Danny Reyes who named it in his forthright 24-year-old way on a morning when Henry was out checking the north fence, and Danny was in the barn with Susan helping treat one of the horses for a minor leg injury. "He's in love with you," Danny said without preamble. Susan focused on the bandaging. "That is a significant thing to say." "It's a significant thing to be true," Danny said. "I've been watching him for a month. He looks at you like you're the most important thing in the room." Every room, all the time. Susan kept her eyes on the horse's leg for a long moment. Then she said, "He has not said anything." "He's not that kind of man," Danny said, with the impatience of someone whose emotional vocabulary was considerably less complicated than the people he was discussing. "He doesn't say things until he knows they're true, but they're true. You can see it plain." "Can you?" she said. "Yes," Danny said, "and so can you if you're honest about it." She was honest about it that evening, lying awake after supper while the house was quiet and the desert was breathing its night sounds through the window. She was honest about the fact that she was in love with Henry Garrison, and that this had happened not in spite of the circumstances that had brought them together but through them, through the strange forced intimacy of a shared crisis and shared purpose, through 6 weeks of learning someone in the necessary, bone-deep way that comes from actual daily life rather than courtship's careful presentation. She loved him, and she did not know with certainty whether he felt the same. She suspected Danny was right. But Henry was a man who had spent years protecting himself from the risk of wanting things, and that kind of careful person did not always know how to say what they felt even when they felt it clearly. She decided she was going to tell him. She did not get the chance that evening, because the following morning was when the response from Santa Fe arrived, and everything accelerated. The man in Santa Fe, whose name was Robert Castillo, and who was a former land surveyor now working in the territorial recorder's office, had sent not just the documents Henry had left with him, but a covering letter that included something new. In the 3 years since Henry had left the evidence with Castillo, the older man had been quietly adding to it. A second incident in New Mexico that bore Crane's fingerprints. A pattern of behavior documented across 3 territories, always the same structure. A corporate loan with punishing clauses used to drive small landowners off valuable land, then the forced sale of adjacent properties. The Callaway incident was not unique. It was a method. Robert Castillo had also written to James Whitfield 6 months ago, before Susan had ever heard Henry's name. The letter from Whitfield arrived the same day as Castillo's package. Whitfield was coming to New Mexico. He had enough to petition the Denver federal court for an investigation of the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company and its practices, and Virgil Crane specifically. He would arrive in Dusty Creek in 10 days. Susan read both letters at the kitchen table and then looked across at Henry, and what she saw in his face was not triumph but something quieter and more complicated. Something that looked like the beginning of a man being set free from something he had been carrying so long he had forgot it was not his natural weight. "It is happening," she said. "It is happening," he agreed. She reached across the table, the same table where he had covered her hand with his 3 weeks ago, and she covered his hand with hers this time. And when he looked up and met her eyes, she said, "Henry, I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I know this started as an arrangement," she said. "And I know that is what you agreed to, and I know you are a man who takes what you have agreed to seriously. But I also know that things have changed, at least for me, and I think perhaps for you as well, and I would rather be honest with you about it and risk being wrong than say nothing and regret it." He was very still. "I love you," she said. "I am in love with you, and I would very much like for you to stay, not because of the ranch or the legal situation or any practical consideration, but because this is your home now, if you want it to be, and I am your wife in every way I know how to be one." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever sat in. She had time, in that silence, to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. And then Henry Garrison, who had spent 9 years building walls and keeping moving and refusing to want anything permanent, looked at her with those pale gray eyes that were utterly unguarded for once, and she saw in them everything that Danny had seen from the outside, everything he had been careful and controlled about for weeks, the love of a man who had not known he was capable of it anymore. "Susan," he said, and his voice was not controlled at all. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he cupped her face in his hands very gently, as if she were something precious and also entirely solid, as if she were both beautiful and real, and he kissed her in a way that was absolutely nothing like the brief careful press to her cheek on their wedding night. He kissed her like a man who meant it, like a man who had arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognized it as the place he had been traveling toward all along. When they finally stepped back from each other, both of them were a little breathless, and neither of them was trying to look unaffected. "I have been trying to figure out how to tell you for 3 weeks," he said. "I did not want to complicate the arrangement." "The arrangement," she said, "has been over for quite some time." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded and warm, and she thought she might never get tired of hearing it. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it has." James Whitfield arrived in Dusty Creek on the appointed day. A compact, serious man in his early 50s, with the contained energy of someone who had spent 30 years doing difficult things in difficult places, and had never found a reason to stop. He sat with Susan and Henry for 2 full days, going through every document and every piece of evidence, and then he sat with Robert Castillo, who had traveled from Santa Fe for this purpose, and with Judge Combs and Marshal Hicks. On the 3rd day, Whitfield filed a formal petition with the Federal Territorial Court and sent copies to Denver by telegraph. The petition named Virgil Crane and 4 officers of the Consolidated Land and Cattle Company by name, and it detailed a pattern of fraudulent lending and forced displacement stretching across 3 territories over 6 years. Crane left Dusty Creek 2 days after the petition was filed. He simply was not there one morning, his rented house empty, his carriage gone. Hicks filed a notice with the territorial marshals, and the federal machinery began to grind. It ground slowly, as it always did, but it ground. By August, Crane had been located in Texas and arrested on federal charges. By October, 2 of the company officers had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges, and the picture they painted was exactly what the evidence had suggested. By December, the foreclosure clause in Thomas Morgan's loan was nullified by the territorial court as part of a broader judgment against the company's predatory lending practices. The debt itself was restructured at terms that Susan could manage comfortably over 3 years. She never had to sell a single acre of her father's land. It was September when she told Henry she was pregnant. They were on the porch again in the evening, the light going copper over the mountains, and she had known for 2 weeks and had been trying to find the right moment, and finally decided there was no right moment that was different from any other moment, because she had married a man who did not need ceremony for the important things. Henry was very quiet for a long time. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression that was completely open, no walls at all, and she saw in it something so layered and alive that it made her eyes sting. Joy and terror and love and the specific quality of a man confronting something he had never known he wanted until it was real. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was the question he always asked first. "I am wonderful," she said. "Are you?" He reached out and pulled her close and held her with his face against her hair, and she felt him exhale something long and slow, as if he were releasing the last of a tension he had been carrying since before she had ever known him. "Yes," he said. "I am more than all right." Their son was born in April of 1884, on a cool spring morning with the mountains clear and sharp against a pale blue sky. They named him Thomas after Susan's father, and Henry held him in the first hour with the careful, wondering attention of a man who understood exactly how much was contained in such a small and perfect thing. Cal and Danny declared themselves the boy's unofficial uncles, and there was nothing to be done about it. Judge Combs came out to see the baby and stayed for supper, and said that Thomas Morgan Sr. would have been satisfied with how things had turned out, and Susan thought he was right. The ranch found its footing. The debt was paid down faster than anticipated because Henry had a methodical, patient approach to financial planning that complemented Susan's instinctive grasp of the operation, and together they were better at this than either had been alone. Henry stopped thinking of himself as a man who had laid something down and started thinking of himself as a man who had picked something up. A life. A real one, full and grounded and his. He put his guns in the locked chest at the back of the bedroom closet, and they stayed there. He did not miss them the way he had expected to. What he had expected to feel was the restlessness of a man without his defining tool, but what he actually felt was the quiet of a man who no longer needed to define himself that way. He was a rancher and a husband and a father, and that was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. That was everything. In the evenings, when Thomas was asleep, and the ranch was quiet, and the desert sky was full of its astonishing western stars, Susan and Henry sat on the porch together and talked, or did not talk, comfortable in the particular silence of people who know each other well enough that silence is not absence. Sometimes she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the stars wheel overhead, and she thought about how much had had to go wrong for things to go this right. The legal proceedings against Crane concluded in the spring of 1885. Crane was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 8 years in the federal penitentiary in Kansas. The Consolidated Land and Cattle Company was dissolved by court order, its assets distributed to compensate the families it had harmed. The family from Callaway, Colorado, the family whose flooding had started all of this, received a settlement that allowed them to buy new land. Henry read that piece of news and was quiet for a long time, and Susan held his hand and let him be quiet, because she understood that he needed to sit with the knowledge that the thing he had carried for 5 years had finally been made right. Robert Castillo got a letter of commendation from the territorial governor, which made him extremely uncomfortable because he was a private man, and he wrote Henry to complain about it in a way that made both of them laugh. James Whitfield went back to Denver and filed 3 more cases based on the evidence uncovered in the investigation, and the territories got a little bit harder for predatory companies to operate in, which was not justice exactly, but was a step in the direction of it. Danny Reyes, who had spent 2 years casting significant looks between Susan and Henry, and refusing to pretend he had not called the whole thing from the beginning, got himself engaged to a young woman named Maria whose family ranched 15 miles east, and his wedding was the social event of Dusty Creek's 1885 season, and Henry was his best man, because by that point the relationship between them was the easy, genuine affection of 2 men who respected each other and had given up trying to be formal about it. Cal remained resolutely unengaged and seemed entirely pleased about it, and continued to be the most reliable hand on the Morgan ranch, which by this point had quietly become known around the territory as the Garrison Ranch, though Susan kept the Morgan name on the legal deed because her father had built it and his name should stay on it, and Henry agreed completely. Their second child came in 1886, a daughter they named Alina, after Susan's mother. She arrived in October with a full head of dark hair exactly like Susan's, and a temperament that her father described as extremely decided, by which he meant she knew what she wanted from approximately the first hour of her life, and was perfectly willing to inform the household. Thomas, who was 2, regarded his sister with the complex combination of delight and alarm that characterizes the firstborn response to a sibling who immediately commands all available attention. Susan sat up in bed the evening after Alina's birth with her daughter in her arms and Henry beside her, and Thomas asleep in his small bed across the room, and she looked at the three of them, her family, this impossible, improbable family that had been assembled from crisis and desperation, and a knock on a hotel door in a dying spring, and she felt something so full and complete that there was not an adequate word for it. Henry was watching her. He had the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was entirely undefended, the one that was just him, no performance or protection. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that if my father had not taken out that loan and if Crane had not filed that clause and if you had not been in this particular town at this particular time and refused Crane's offer, none of this would exist." She looked down at Alina, and I cannot decide whether that is terrifying or miraculous. "Both," Henry said. "I think it is both." She looked up at him. "Do you regret it, any of it?" He looked at her, at the children, at the room that had become the center of his world in a way he could not have imagined and could no longer imagine being without, and he said what was simply and entirely true. "Not for one single day," he said. He leaned forward and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him, and Alina made a small decisive sound in her sleep, and Thomas turned over in his little bed and sighed the deep sigh of a sleeping child, and outside the desert night was enormous and clear and full of stars, and inside this house that had been built by honest labor and inherited through love, and defended by truth, and the willingness of a proud man to lay down his pride for a woman who needed him, everything was exactly as it should be. Pete Harlow, who had held his land through everything and was now 81 years old and moving slowly but with excellent spirits, came for supper on Sundays sometimes. He had known Susan since she was born, and he had watched her grow, and he had been at her father's funeral, and he had heard about the whole business with Crane in pieces over 2 years, and the Sunday after Alina was born he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at Henry with the evaluating eye of someone who had known a great many men over a long life. "Heard about you before you came," the old man said. "Heard all kinds of things." "I imagine you did," Henry said. "Most of it probably true, some of it probably not," Harlow said. "That's how it generally works with a man who gets a reputation." He looked at Susan, who was feeding Alina in the rocking chair her mother had used. "She looks like Alina Sr.," he said, meaning the baby. "That's a good thing." He drank his coffee. "You did right by this land and this family," he said to Henry. "Her father would have said so." Henry nodded once. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but the weight of it settled around him like something that had been a long time in arriving. "I intend to keep doing right by them," he said. "I know you do," Harlow said. "That's why I said so." The winter of 1886 was hard, the way Western winters could be hard, weeks of cold that tested the cattle and kept everyone inside more than they liked. But the ranch had been well prepared, the hay stores sufficient, the fencing solid, and they came through it without serious loss. Susan kept the accounts through the winter evenings while Henry read to Thomas, who had developed a ferocious appetite for stories and would accept nothing less than 20 minutes of reading per night as a condition of going to sleep. Alina, at 3 months, had no opinion on the reading but enjoyed the sound of her father's voice and frequently went to sleep during it, which Thomas considered a personal endorsement. The spring of 1887 arrived, and the land greened up along the creek bottoms, and the cattle fattened on new grass, and Susan found herself thinking, one morning while she was riding the perimeter fence with Henry beside her, and the sun coming up gold over the eastern range, that this was exactly the life her parents had been building toward. They had been building it for her, she thought, even if they had not known it. They had built the land and the work and the honest foundation, and she had carried it through the crisis, and Henry had walked in from the desert and helped her hold it, and now it was theirs, fully and permanently theirs, and whatever came next they would face it together. Henry looked over at her as they rode and caught her expression, whatever it was, and he gave her the real smile, the full one, the rare one that changed his whole face. "Good morning," he said, as if he had just noticed it. "Good morning," she said back. They rode together along the fence line in the early light, the horses steady and calm, the desert waking up around them in its slow, unhurried way, and the world was ordinary and beautiful and entirely sufficient. The gunslinger's reputation, that careful construction of danger and distance that he had worn for years like armor, had been laid down on a courtroom morning in April of 1883, when a woman with dark hair and frightened eyes told him he did not have to do this, and he told her he had given her his word. It had stayed down, not because it had been defeated or exposed or taken from him, but because he had chosen to put it aside in favor of something more substantial. In favor of a life that was real and a love that was genuine, and a family that was his in every way that mattered. And Susan Morgan, who had knocked on a hotel room door out of desperation, and found something she had not been looking for and could not have planned for, had gotten more than she had bargained for in the best possible way. She had gotten the land in the end. But more than the land, she had gotten a partner who chose her every day, who listened and respected and loved without the diminishment that sometimes passed for love. A man who had been afraid to stay anywhere long enough to call it home, and who had found, in the hard practical work of saving her family's ranch, that home was not a place he had been avoiding but a thing he had been waiting to earn. He had earned it. She had let him earn it, and then they had built it together, the way the best things in that country were built, out of difficulty and honesty and the willingness to trust in something before you were entirely sure it was safe to do so. Young Thomas grew up knowing the land the way his mother knew it, from the inside, with his feet in the soil and his hands in the work of it. Eleanor grew up knowing her own mind with a clarity that made her parents alternately exasperated and proud, and she had her grandmother's name and her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes, and she was something entirely herself. And on evenings when the sky was doing what western skies did best, which was to be so enormous and colorful and alive that it seemed impossible that the world could contain it, Susan and Henry sat on the porch of the house that Thomas and Eleanor Morgan had built and watched the light change over the mountains, and the story of how they had come to be there was contained in all of it. In the land and the house and the two sleeping children inside, and the particular quality of the silence between two people who have nothing left to prove to each other and nothing left to hide. The proud gunslinger had laid down his reputation on the day she needed a husband. He had found in its place something he had not known he was looking for, and she, who had gone looking for a practical solution and knocked on a stranger's door with her hands trembling and her heart in her throat, had found something she had not dared to hope for. They had found each other, and they kept finding each other, every morning and every evening, for the rest of their long and ordinary and entirely extraordinary lives.